After the ceasefire, only 2 ships passed through the Strait of Hormuz in a full day. Not 20, not 50, 2. So before anyone tells you Tehran showed up weak, start with the one fact that strips the makeup off. This story, the war had supposedly paused, but the artery the world depends on was still half under Iran's shadow. Then came the second crack. Iran said Lebanon was part of the ceasefire. Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu said it was not, and the strikes continued anyway. So the talks did not begin with order. They began with both sides already fighting over the meaning of the deal before the real bargaining had even started. That is the pressure underneath Vance snapping, "Don't play us." Men do not sound like that when the other side has already accepted its place. They sound like that when the side they were told is cornered walks into the room bruised, defiant, and still capable of making everybody around the table deeply uncomfortable. If this is your kind of coverage, the version that treats power like power, not like public relations, subscribe right now and drop one word in the comments: bluff or leverage. Because this entire story turns on which one you think Tehran was holding when Vance lost patience. That is the sentence that blows the title wide open. The weakened Iranian regime still had leverage. Not enough to erase the damage, not enough to claim some fantasy victory, but enough to arrive in Islamabad, acting like the war had not stripped it of the right to demand, delay, and test Washington's nerve in front of the world. And that is why people clicked, not for a policy lecture, not for another recycled both sides remain far apart script. They clicked because they sensed something uglier. The side Washington kept describing as battered was still refusing to behave like the weaker side, and Vance's tone sounded less like domination than irritation. This is the kind of moment viewers feel before they fully understand it. A line gets delivered. The cameras catch the anger. The headline says strength, but your gut says something else is wrong here. If Tehran had really walked in empty-handed, why did the American vice president sound like a man warning the room not to notice how much pressure was still alive? Because power in negotiations is not measured by who hit harder last week. It is measured by who can still make the next 72 hours dangerous. And by the time these talks opened, Tehran could still make shipping dangerous, markets dangerous, ceasefire language dangerous, and political optics dangerous. By the time the public saw the trip, Vance had already been working the exit ramp. He had been in regular contact with Pakistani negotiators and speaking often with Field Marshal Asim Munir about an off-ramp before the plane ride became political theater. So Islamabad was not a victory tour. It was the public phase of a crisis. Washington had already been trying to cool behind the curtain. That matters because it changes the meaning of everything he said before boarding that aircraft. Those comments were not the first move. They were the controlled public face of a problem already serious enough to require back channels, mediators, and an off-ramp before the world even saw the handshake choreography. And it also tells you something brutal about how Washington read the danger. If this were a simple endgame, Vance would not need to be there, in that role, with that tone, at that time. He was there because somebody in the White House understood that a story of total control could collapse very fast if Tehran kept proving it, could still jam the system where it hurt most. That is why the title cannot be read like a generic confrontation clip. The point is not that Vance was angry. The point is what made anger necessary. Tehran was not being spoken to like a defeated state accepting terms. Tehran was being warned because it still had enough room to shake the atmosphere, and everybody involved knew it. And the timing was toxic. The ceasefire was already being described as on the precipice of collapsing before the first real round of bargaining could settle in. That meant every word in Islamabad sat on top of a threat. One misread line, one unmet condition, one public contradiction too far, and the whole thing could swing right back into escalation. This is exactly why Tehran arrived with posture instead of apology. A fragile ceasefire does not reward humility. It rewards the side that can raise the cost of collapse while making the other side own the panic of failure. That is why wounded powers often behave most aggressively, not when they are strongest, but when they know the room still cannot afford to ignore them. And that is what a lot of coverage misses. Tehran did not need to convince anyone it had won. It only needed to convince Washington that the next breakdown would not be clean, quick, or cheap. Once that happens, the weaker side stops looking passive and starts looking dangerous. That is the switch the audience came here to feel. Then Tehran made the posture impossible to miss. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf said two things had to happen before negotiations begin: a ceasefire in Lebanon and the release of Iran's blocked assets. That is not the body language of surrender. That is the language of a state saying, you are not the only one who gets to define what happens next. Now the title starts paying off in full. Tehran arrives acting like it holds the cards does not mean Tehran strutted in, pretending it had somehow reversed the whole war. It means it walked in, setting conditions, forcing responses, and behaving like survival itself had purchased a voice bigger than Washington was comfortable hearing. That distinction is everything. This was not delusion. This was bargaining psychology. Tehran was saying, you hit us, but you did not hit us into silence. You damaged us, but you did not damage us enough to make us enter the room empty. That is a much more dangerous message than propaganda victory chants, because it is harder to dismiss and harder to punish without reopening the whole crisis. And once that posture is on the table, anger from the stronger side becomes revealing, because irritation at a weaker enemy usually means that enemy has found a narrow but painful point of resistance that stronger side cannot flatten on cue. Washington answered with a red line it could not soften in public: no enrichment inside Iran. The White House said that had not changed. So before the talks could hide behind diplomatic language, both sides were already standing on opposite sides of the deepest fault line in the room, whether Iran still gets to define part of its sovereignty after the war. That is why these talks were never going to be some dry, technical exercise. Once one side says enrichment is a sovereign right, and the other says that right is finished, you are not negotiating over paperwork. You are negotiating over status, legitimacy, and whether war rewrote the political identity of the state that survived it. So Tehran's swagger was not cosmetic. It was strategic. If it entered soft, it would be conceding the bigger fight before the details even arrived. Its attitude was part of the demand. Its tone was part of the message, and Washington knew that if it let that posture sit unanswered, the public optics of the room would tilt fast. This is where Vance's line gets sharper. Don't play us was not just a threat against gamesmanship. It was an attempt to stop Tehran from controlling the frame before the actual substance of the talks could even be fought over. In other words, he was not just resisting demands. He was resisting the image of an Iran that still felt entitled to make them. Then the paper itself turned into a battlefield. One version of Iran's 10-point proposal suggested the US had, in principle, accepted continued enrichment. That meant the fight was no longer only over what was happening in the room. It was also over to got to define a room to the public before any final agreement existed. This is the information war layer that separates intelligence from headline reading. Tehran needed its audience to believe endurance had forced recognition. Washington needed its audience to believe pressure had dragged Iran back toward compliance. Both sides were trying to lock the camera angle before the negotiation had even stopped moving, and that is why the public statements sounded so incompatible. They were incompatible. They were designed to be. Each side needed maximum flexibility in private and maximum hardness in public. Tehran could not look like it was surrendering rights. Washington could not look like it was negotiating under duress. So both told stories that made themselves look less constrained than they really were. That is not a sideshow. That is part of the battlefield. Now, when a negotiation carries war damage, economic risk, regional escalation, and domestic political consequences all at once, the public narrative becomes one more frontline. And over all of it sat the most telling contradiction in the whole story. Trump swung between calling for peace and threatening to destroy Iran's civilization, while the regime he had spent weeks battering was still standing and had the tightened control over the Strait of Hormuz. That is the picture Vance was walking into. Overwhelming military power on one side, but unresolved leverage on the other. That is why the phrase "hold the cards" works emotionally, even if it is too strong literally. Tehran did not hold every card in the deck, but it held the few that mattered most, at the exact point where negotiations become vulnerable, the cards that make walking away costly and looking away impossible. And when a weaker side keeps hold of the few cards that matter at the moment of decision, it can act much bigger than it really is. That is what viewers instinctively picked up in the title. Not that Iran had magically become dominant, but that it was still able to carry itself like a player the stronger side could not simply wave off. This is why Vance's frustration had real dramatic weight. He was not yelling down from a mountain. He was speaking from inside a room, where the official American story of control was colliding with the evidence of unfinished pressure, and the force option that could truly settle the traffic question was no clean answer. One estimate said securing the Strait of Hormuz by force could require 3 U.S. infantry divisions, roughly 30,000 to 45,000 troops. So behind every confident line about reopening the waterway was a darker possibility. Another long, ugly commitment with the smell of another open-ended war. That is when Tehran's surviving leverage turns from theory into hard pressure. It did not need to overpower the United States across the board. It only needed to make the finish this by force option look longer, bloodier, riskier, and more politically toxic than Washington wanted to admit on camera. And that matters enormously for Vance. He is not just any negotiator in this story. He is the anti-forever war figure in Trump's orbit, the man whose political identity is tied to skepticism about endless foreign entanglements. So when he says, "Don't play us," he is also speaking from inside the shadow of the one outcome most poisonous to his own future. A deeper war nobody can cleanly close. That makes the title even harsher. Tehran did not just arrive testing Washington, it arrived testing Vance personally, testing whether the man sent to shut down the games could do it without getting dragged deeper into the kind of conflict he was supposed to be different from, and the pressure was already crossing into American life. Inflation jumped to 3.3% in March after 2.4% in February. That means the fight over Hormuz was no longer trapped in maps and naval warnings. It had started bleeding into household anxiety, consumer anger, and the domestic political risk sitting behind every White House line about strength. That is a card, not a glorious one, not a parade card, but a card all the same. Because once disruption lands in fuel, costs, prices, and political moods, time stops serving the stronger side the way people assume it will. Every day of uncertainty starts asking who can absorb chaos better. And that question gets uglier when the stronger side promised control. So no, Tehran did not need to look triumphant. It only needed to look costly. It only needed to prove that the war had not stripped it of the ability to drag the next phase into discomfort. Once it did that, its entire negotiating posture changed. It could arrive not as the victor, but as the side still capable of poisoning the alternatives. That is, the hidden brutality in the title, Vance snaps, is the visible event. The invisible event is why the snap happened at all. He was staring at a government Washington wanted the world to see as cornered, while the actual evidence kept saying that corners still had teeth. So here is the honest answer. Did Tehran really hold the cards? Not all of them, not most of them in a total military sense, but it held enough of the right cards at the right minute by the Strait, the ceasefire ambiguity, the Lebanon dispute, the optics of defiance, the ability to force public answers to make the stronger side sound angrier than comfortable. And that is exactly what the audience came here for. The click was not about whether Iran was winning. The click was about whether Vance's fury revealed a deeper imbalance than the official language admitted. The answer is yes. His tone only makes full sense once you see that Tehran was not behaving like a side entering for instructions. It was behaving like a side entering to test how much it could still force. If Tehran was bluffing, then Washington still believed the bluff was dangerous enough to send the vice president into a fragile room under a breaking ceasefire. If Tehran was not bluffing, then the war had already taught its ugliest lesson. You can hit an enemy hard, wreck its position, and still fail to make it arrive quietly. Either way, the The same conclusion survives impact. This was not the clean diplomacy that follows decisive submission. This was the price of discovering that a damaged enemy with control over the right choke points can still bend the emotional weather of a negotiation. That is the final answer, and it is hard, Vance snapped, because Tehran came in acting like it still had the power to force movement, delay movement, or make movement so expensive that Washington had to answer it seriously. The disturbing part is not that he got angry. The disturbing part is that the evidence says Tehran had enough left to justify the warning. So the title does pay off, but only once you strip away the fake simplicity. Tehran did not arrive holding the whole deck. It arrived holding enough of the deck that the United States could not end the story on its own terms. And once you understand that, the line "don't play us" stops sounding like closure. It starts sounding like what it really was, a warning shouted into a room where the game was still alive. Stay locked in here. This channel keeps following the pressure point after everyone else goes back to repeating the script.